on this subject, addressing Singapore's key public housing problems, asset protection, affordability and access, a citizens' non-partisan policy proposal. Now that I've got my reading glasses on, I can't see all of you. Sorry to unload my aging woes on you. We're actually here to talk about the aging flats. Okay. My name is Chu Keng Chuan, or Casey Chu, and I'm your moderator for this presentation organized by FOSG. I shall be introducing the speakers, and later on in the Q&A, I shall be facilitating the session. However, I've been additionally tasked to give an introduction to the subject of today's presentation as well. So let me alert you that my remarks are going to take more like 10 minutes than 1 minute. And so let me just go on to the agenda, the program. I'll begin by saying something about the organizer of this presentation, FOSG. FOSG, the Future of Singapore Forum, is a citizens' forum made up of concerned citizens who wish to contribute to the constructive, evidence-based, non-partisan public debate on key issues concerning our future, including the economy, social and global industrial policy, education, the arts, our regional environment, entrepreneurship, urban planning, and land use. We cover quite a lot of ground. And pardon me for reading from my script. The details are too important for me to speak extemporaneously. FOSG is convened and curated by veteran urban planner, architect, and public intellectual Tay Keng Soon, and a group of concerned citizens. FOSG hopes to stimulate better understanding of the real issues facing Singapore today and in the future. Today's presentation is also co-hosted by the Wee Kim Wee Centre at SMU. I would like to say that while the Wee Kim Wee Centre has been most gracious in providing us the venue for today's session, FOSG is entirely responsible for the content of today's presentation. But do let me say something about the Wee Kim Wee Centre. The Wee Kim Wee Centre of SMU is dedicated to promoting cross-cultural and interdisciplinary dialogue within the SMU community and with the public about the major issues and challenges that attend to contemporary life. The late President Wee Kim Wee, after whom the Wee Kim Wee Centre in Singapore, at Singapore Management University is named, understood the value of critical dialogue between alternative perspectives, social and cultural diversity, civic engagement, and lifelong learning. It is in honor of these values and commitments that the Centre hosts and supports lectures, conferences, and publications. Now, let me say something about the big picture of today's topic. Singapore has a stellar reputation in achieving the most extensive, high quality and successful national housing program in the world. The proposals that are presented today seek to address the key potential long-term crises in public housing and to improve upon them. There are two major problems facing public housing today. First, HDB flat owners have no security of tenure beyond 99 years, and the capital values of their flats will sharply diminish towards the end of the 99-year lease. As a result, their life savings will depreciate significantly as they age. As things currently stand, the value of HDB owners' flats will become zero at the end of their 99-year lease, unless they are fortunate enough to qualify for SERS, midway. SERS refers to the Selective En bloc Redevelopment Scheme, SERS. However, for the bottom 50% of income earners, the bulk of their net worth or the life savings is in the value of the HDB flat. For most of them, when their flats go beyond the 40 to 50-year mark, the value of HDB flats tends to decline rapidly, just when the owners need to capitalize on their flats' values to fund their retirement the most. Neither the proposed VERS, which stands for Voluntary Early Redevelopment Scheme, VERS, nor the current Short-lease Flexi-Flats and the Lease Buyback Scheme, LBS, adequately address this problem. Secondly, the current cost of HDB flats for first-time buyers of BTO flats relative to their income is very high, with the result that it typically takes now about 25 years for home buyers to pay off their housing loans. This effectively means that for the greater part of their working lives, many Singaporeans are channeling a significant part of their disposable income to paying off their HDB flats, leaving insufficient savings for retirement, medical expenses, and education upgrading. The problem is exacerbated for the lower, irregular, or uncertain incomes that makes home ownership difficult. The challenge we have, therefore, is to craft reform proposals which not only address the concerns identified above, but which are also affordable, fiscally responsible, and do not destabilize the existing housing market. To this end, the speakers propose 4 major reforms to public housing that will address these problems and greatly improve the well-being of all Singapore citizens. The 3 people who are the authors of the policy paper on which this presentation is based have the relevant and necessary domain knowledge to approach this complex problem. They come from the fields of real estate analysis and finance, economics, and urban planning and architecture. So we have from the real estate market analysis and finance domain, Mr. Khoo Swee Yong. From the economist and social policy analyst perspective, we have Mr. Yeo Lam Keong. And from the viewpoint of a veteran architect and urban planner, we have Professor Teh Kheng Soon. Let me give a brief introduction of our 3 speakers today. Mr. Khoo Swee Yong is the key executive officer of International Property Advisors Private Limited in Singapore and an adjunct faculty of Singapore Management University and Ngee Ann Polytechnic. We're at Singapore National University and Ngee Ann Kongsi Auditorium. Bit of a coincidence. He was the director in the Real Estate Centre of Expertise at Societe Generale Private Banking, responsible for advising clients on real estate investments, the director of Marketing and Business Development at Seville Singapore, and the general manager at Far East Organisations Indonesia office. Swee Yong has written 5 books on the property market. Swee Yong studied at Imperial College London and the Institut Louis Pasteur at the University of Strasbourg in France. He then obtained his MBA from the University of Hull. Next, Teh Kheng Soon. Adjunct NUS professor, architect Teh Kheng Soon is one of the first locally trained architects graduating in 1963 from the Singapore Polytechnic School of Building and Architecture. The architecture school was then later relocated to NUS. So he is acutely concerned with the architecture and living environment, that architecture and living environment must be rooted in climate and culture while modernizing and humanizing people and place. He was the founding chairman of the Substation, the experimental center of the arts community. He was chairman of SPUR, Singapore Planning and Urban Research Group, in the 1970s, and later president of the Singapore Institute of Architects, receiving its gold medal in 2010. His design research extends beyond architectural scale to urban planning and finally to the global scale. He is a fellow of the World Academy of Art and Science and a member of the World Acoustics Society. Currently, he is convener of FOSG, the Future of Singapore Forum Group. Last but not least, as they like to say, Yeo Lam Keong. Lam Keong is currently a private economics consultant and was an adjunct professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, where he lectured on economics and social policy. He studied at the London School of Economics, where he obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees in economics. He has worked in the Economic Development Board and the Monetary Authority of Singapore, but he is best known as the former chief economist at GIC, a position he held for 10 years. In the course of investigating these issues and formulating the proposed solutions, the speakers and authors of the policy paper consulted widely with prominent economists, lawyers, investment professionals, academics, architects, property developers, as well as a number of ordinary HDB dwellers. So finally, we do not claim that these proposals are the last word on, or the final form of, the solutions to these difficult and complex problems of public housing in Singapore. However, we at FOSG has done our best to try to contribute a rigorous set of policy proposals that will hopefully serve as a starting point, a solid framework, and a firm foundation for public and policy considerations on these important issues that affect all citizens. Okay, I'm finally going to sit down. So now, to begin his presentation, I invite Mr. Khoo Swee Yong to the podium. Swee Yong.
Thank you for being here, ladies and gentlemen. I will be summarizing the full paper, and then I will let Professor Teh and Lam Kiong expound on some of the rationale for our recommendations. So this is a little bit repetitive. We always start out by expressing our appreciation, especially 饮水思源. My grandparents, my parents have benefited from a fantastic public housing scheme. What we are trying to do here is to ensure that our children and our grandchildren and their grandchildren can also enjoy a very solid public housing scheme. So while things have been going on well for the last 50 years, 5 decades, glorious years, we have now come to a point where there are major challenges which we have to deal with. If you would like to come up here to sit, to sit yourself, yeah. There are 2 major challenges which Casey has touched on a little bit. First, decaying value of old flats. 20 years ago, we would be saying that, look, 99 years is a long time. Look at other countries, 25 years, 50 years. In Singapore, we haven't come to that stage yet. But it seems like we are now entering a phase where we have got to start dealing with this fuse on the bomb that is shortening as we speak. The decaying values of old flats also coincide with an aging population, and our fathers and grandfathers, their life savings, especially for the bottom 50% of the population, the bulk of their life savings are tied up in their HDB flats. And these old HDB flats values are shrinking as they need to retire and cash out to fund their retirement. Secondly, the current prices of BTO flats relative to young people's first-time home buyers' salaries, incomes, as well as the poor people or people with irregular income is pretty high. So that gap is something that we want to address. So we will have 4 proposals today. One is a lease renewal proposal. The other, an extensive rebuilding program, as well as then how we can deal with the second challenge, reducing BTO prices for home buyers, and then having more rental flats to allow our low-income earners an option. Today, the option is only one, please buy flats. Tomorrow, that option should be expanded. So, first, before we go into the solutions, how do we define old flats? In our paper, old flats are defined as flats over 50 years since completion. Not sure if you would be able to picture some of them. Consider Commonwealth Crescent. Consider, for example, Circuit Road, Aljunied. Look, I'm not giving you guys tips on how to buy something that would give you a windfall because SERS is coming. There are a lot of old flats. But just so that you can keep a mental image for what these old flats might be, I'm mentioning 2 locations. So, Circuit Road in Aljunied area, Commonwealth Crescent. Flats over 50 years of age means that they are left with 49 years or less on their leases. So let's look forward as well as backward. How many flats were completed in the 1960s since HDB was formed, then in the 70s and 80s? From the chart, from HDB's annual report, we can see that next year we will have 220,000 flats that are more than 40 years old. We can safely assume the 1960s flats have more or less been demolished, except some of those that we have put under conservation in Tiong Bahru, for example. So the 1960s flats are almost all gone. 1970s flats, by the year 2020, they are more than 40 years old. 300,000 flats are 30 to 40 years old. I'll give you a clearer reason why we are focused on this 40 to 50-year transition mark. Now, extrapolate 10 years from today. More than 200,000 flats will be more than 50 years old. And more than 500,000 flats. Today's total stock is 1.06 million. But 10 years from today, half of today's stock will be more than 40 years old. Okay, so remember these rough numbers, because later on I'll explain the value depreciation. So the issue that we are facing today, just now, we talked about 2 issues. Value depreciation of old flats is the first one. The 99-year lease causes the value of the remaining lease to drop, and it hits hard from after the 50-year mark. The flat value forms 75% to 90% of the bottom 50% of our household's asset value, their savings. And if your HDB flat forms so much of your savings, and yet it is depreciating away as you are moving from 70 years age to 80 years age, it will form a bit of a livelihood issue, because we can't really eat our bricks to live. So it threatens our retirement adequacy if we allow the flat values to keep depreciating. This is the Singapore Land Authority leasehold table. You are comparing 2 pieces of land, not built yet, 2 pieces of land, 1 piece freehold, another piece 99 years, and you're comparing its value over time. And so there was a Mr. Bala who worked for our government who did this calculation, and in the 1950s, your calculators are abacuses. And so there's some rounding off errors and there are some assumptions put into it, but later on in the next 2 charts, I'll explain a little bit about the Bala's table and the depreciation of our HDB. Then the second problem now that we are trying to address is the high cost of new HDB flats, HDB BTO prices, relative to the current income of first-time home buyers, plus moving forward into the gig economy in the next 10 years, more and more people will be having unstable incomes. Buying a home and locking yourself into a 25 years loan with monthly repayment requirements has a basic assumption that the young couple has got a steady income. But when one of the two lose their jobs, it is a 50% income reduction. So that's going to be a huge impact. Okay, so we detour a little bit to explain Bala's table. This is the table that is used. In this one, there are two tables, there are two charts. One, the blue line, which is the Bala's table. The other one is the black line, that is an estimate that the Center for Livable Cities, two researchers, Quack and Ho, decided to run a more modern method of estimating how Mr. Bala arrived at his curve. But suffice to say, at the 50-year mark, land value drops by about 25%. That's the green straight line here. And then at the 70-year mark, the red vertical line, it shows that the value drops by about 40% as compared to a freehold land value. This is not with property built on it. So this table is important because it is the reference that HDB SLA will use if you decided to sell back part of your HDB lease to the government for cash. This is a reference. For a property developer who has bought an old 99-year piece of land that is, say, left with 60 years, let's say Mandarin Gardens go on block, and it has, Mandarin Gardens is about 30 over years old, and to top up the lease back to 99 years, this is the reference table. So it's either to top up leases to be paid a fee to the government, or it is for the government to pay you when you are selling back some of your lease to the government. So this is the reference, and that's why Bala's table is important. However, Bala's table actually refers to a theoretical maximum value because it just assumes two pieces of land, one freehold, 199 years, or 60 years if it is industrial land. It doesn't assume market conditions such as home loan restrictions, CPF usage restrictions. So as a HDB flat gets older and older, this curve attempts to simulate a Marine Parade HDB flat that is at 56 years of lease. And how, as it goes forward, fewer and fewer young people will be able to afford to buy this old flat because of restrictions on loans and because of restrictions on CPF usage. So they must take out more cash. They must loan for a shorter period of time, or they can only loan a smaller quantum of money to buy the flat. So that shrinks the pool of addressable buyers, and if there are fewer buyers for your flats, naturally there will be a lower price as the flat ages. So Bala's table shows a theoretical maximum price. In effect, the depreciation of flats that are beyond 40 and beyond 50 years of age, the depreciation is actually worse. So that eats into the retirement wealth that our parents and grandparents have stored up for their life. So our four proposals, starting from the first two, which will be dealing with how we combat the issue of decaying property values. We want to propose a lease renewal program for old age HDB flats. Any HDB flat hitting its 50-year mark will be automatically renewed back to a 99-year lease, a one-time automatic top-up of HDB flat leases. Current flats that are past its 50-year mark, we recommend a top-up back to 99 years once the policy is adopted and enacted. There will be a fee to pay when you get this lease extension. This fee to pay, we are proposing a 3% of average market value of resale HDB flat in your vicinity of comparable types. You will repay this 3% over the next 10 years. We are proposing that the fee be even lower or just a nominal value for low-income families. So that has got to come from a means test. Second proposal, again to tackle the issue of decaying leases, decaying property values. We want to recommend that every HDB flat be rebuilt before it hits its 100-year mark. The rebuilding will be at government cost. It will be for Singapore citizens only. So permanent residents who happen to be in a flat that has reached the 90 to 100 years of age, when this program comes to your neighborhood, PRs would have to sell back its remaining lease to the HDB, sort of like a SERS, and then PRs can rebuy another resale flat in the open market. So PRs will not have this privilege of having a brand new HDB flat rebuilt for them. Thirdly, and fourthly, which is dealing with the affordability of BTOs as well as the low-income earners and the gig economy wage earners, we suggest that BTO flats be sold at construction cost price of around $180 per square foot. That would mean a 3-room flat would be at about $100,000. This would be 55 to 60% of current resale flat prices, and it would reduce the need for long-term home loans for our home buyers, especially for the younger families. It would reduce from a 25-year loan, which is typically what a young family would be taking, down to 10 to 15 years. Each young citizen will be entitled to a one-time purchase of such a BTO. We think that by working out the sums, actually $180 per square foot is sort of leaning on the high side already, and that the inflation of construction costs, if we had such a big program in place of reconstructing every HDB flat over a 100-year period, that we'll be able to hedge some of these costs because we can plan forward, we can buy materials forward in a big way, and so inflation on construction costs should be manageable and minimized. However, if we were to suddenly reduce BTO flats pricing down to $180 per square foot, there's a concern that it may then hit the resale market values. It may even hit private residential properties values. So to alleviate this, young people who are subscribing to buy these very affordable flats will be locked in with a minimum occupation period of 15 years. And if during these 15 years, due to financial hardships or changes of their life situations, they really need to encash it back, HDB will take back these 15-year-old or 10-year-old flats from them at a cost plus adjustment factor. And the adjustment could be based on published interest rates, published inflation rates, published GDP growth rates. So we are asking for a transparent formula in terms of this pricing. Having this 15-year runway where we lock up these cheap flats from being sold in the open market, we will prevent them from competing with resale pool of flats within the first 15-year period. Market prices would start to adjust such that prices of the resale market will also be more moderate and will stop running away sky high. Then, still on proposal 3, we further propose that every citizen be entitled to a second bite of the cherry when they are above 65 years old, because our starting point is a concern for retirement adequacy of our old folks. So at 65 years old and after, if you had enjoyed one-time BTO, low-cost pricing, fine, you are allowed a second time. If during your lifetime you have never bought a first-time BTO, after 65 you are still allowed to downgrade from your private apartment, for example, to buy a smaller size flat, again at the $180 per square foot cost. Because the aging demographics, just like the aging HDB flats, look at the chart. It is not something that we can rewind. Every day we are getting one day older. Look at the baby boomer group within the next 10 to 15 years, the shrinkage of that group is not by choice. When that group shrinks, 90% of them are homeowners, 80% of them are HDB owners. They will be bequeathing the property that they own to their children. But their children, who are probably at, say, the 40 years age group, they are already homeowners. So when these age cohorts start to pass away in the next 10 to 20 years, the most likely scenario is that their HDB flats would be out in the resale market. And who would be buying in the next 10 to 20 years? These small cohorts, much smaller than the cohort that is going to be passing away. So there will be an excess of resale supply versus young children's demand for these old age flats. And that will exacerbate the price pressure downwards further. Who asked you all didn't give birth more? So we are also adding into our proposal the final bullet point that HDB ought to build more low-cost studio flats. Today, HDB is building low-cost studio flats, what we call the two-room plus study. But in terms of absolute numbers, this year, HDB launched like 16 to 17,000 built to offer flats, BTO flats. But out of that, 10%, 1,000, maybe in the low-cost studio flats. Look at the cohort of people passing the 65-year mark. So this is insufficient today. But more importantly, these flats be sold not with 30-year lease. These flats should be sold with 99-year lease, so it satisfies the bequest, the desire to bequest or to will your property to your loved ones and your beneficiaries. Proposal number 4, for low-income families, we are asking for an increase in the number of good quality subsidized rental flats. Basically, for the bottom 30% income earners, including zero income, including retirees. Subsidized rental flats must come with security of tenancy, unlike today's subsidized rental flats, where you have got to justify every 3 months about how poor you are and how needy you are before you are allowed to continue renting the flats. This one, we are proposing that the tenancy agreement be signed such that it is strongly in favor of the tenant, not strongly in favor of the landlord, and that it should be pegged to a percentage of the take-home pay. We are basically looking at the bottom 30% income earners. Just a sidetrack. Out of 1.33 million households we have today, bottom 30% includes about 260,000 households. The 260,000 households earn up to $3,999 a month. And this $3,999 a month includes employer CPF contributions. If I'm not wrong, it also includes government handouts. Can you imagine $3,999 minus CPF, take-home pay is how much? And then this $3,999 actually includes government handouts, such as some of the GST rebates, utility rebates. And we have got 360,000 of such households amongst us. Then, furthermore, 15 to 20% of today's housing stock could be set aside for rental. Today's housing stock is 1.06 million. So about 150,000 to 200,000 should be set aside to satisfy the needs of this 360,000. So we are in fact offering them an option to continue to rent. And if you were rich and you downgraded from a private property, but you are at 70 years old, you really want to enjoy the cash that you have saved, sell your private property and have an option to rent too, because you are a zero income earner. Okay. Despite these proposals, we believe that there will still be families who are unable to pay for lease renewal, the lease extension, and they are unable to probably take care of some of the municipal fees as well. So again, we want to ask for means-tested subsidies for the very poor households so that no one gets left behind. So how does this benefit Singaporeans? How does it benefit you and me? We will have improved security and retirement adequacy. We will have affordable, high-quality housing that we refresh because we are rebuilding them every 100 years. We will definitely have a lot more savings available for investments, for our entertainment, for our leisure, and more importantly, because we are a growing population, we want to see more cash being available for healthcare needs. For first-time home buyers, of course, the much lower price of a BTO flat, cheaper and more affordable, celebration for them. Shorter term loan, shorter locked-in handcuffs of the 10 to 15-year bank or HDB loans would free our youngsters also for more entrepreneurial pursuits and investments. And then, more importantly, the last bullet point, low-income earners as well as the gig economy income earners. Just recall in the 2 weeks ago, the PMD meet the minister sessions. So many income earners today are not having stable long-term income. Our proposals extend to them a lot of additional security such that they can get their life back in order, not having to worry about cash flow every day. Then how does this benefit Singapore? Macro-wise, improvement in retirement adequacy means that the state doesn't have to fund so much more social welfare programs. It removes some of the social welfare costs from the people who needs it today. National reserves, we believe, will keep increasing. Later on, I'll ask Professor Tay, when he is talking about this urban regeneration, how come land value and our national reserves will keep adding on. Upgrading of all our homes every 100 years. We've got about 25 HDB estates. Each estate, on average, 4 years, we will upgrade one estate. That estate becomes the smartest estate in Singapore because it will have the best technology, communications, it will have data centers incorporated within a housing estate. The transportation system can include drones as well as driverless vehicles and a lot more high-tech tech that is disrupting our work and creating the gig economy today. Those will all be incorporated every time we refresh the HDB estates. So, I've come to the end of my piece. I now invite Lam Kiong to explain to you the economics of how we think that this can be put together and that it is actually not too expensive, this entire program that we are proposing. Lam Kiong, please.
Thanks very much, Swee Yong. I must admit, I haven't really heard this full presentation of Swee Yong. I was actually quite spellbound by what you said, but so I'll try to get back to what I have to say. Now, before I'd just like to give a quick preamble. While many of us take it for granted, actually, HDB managed housing is the single boldest, most audacious, most radical, most successful, amazingly successful social policy that's ever been enacted by the PAP, and in housing terms that has ever been enacted by any government in the world. We take this for granted, but if you look at it objectively, that's what it is. Now, it involves not just reasonably up-to-date and high-quality homes. It involves as well that are largely home-owned, a whole infrastructure, urban infrastructure of recreational centers, swimming pools, complexes, parks, park connectors, beautiful malls, as an integrated living environment. This is equal nowhere in the world, even in Scandinavia, the champions of social protection, there is nothing like it. So although we do like Scandinavia in overall social protection, as far as housing goes, we are still the king. Okay. In addition to this, we have to keep in mind, at the same time, HDB flats are also the single largest asset in savings and retirement for the majority of our population, especially the bottom 50%, where it forms an overwhelming majority of their savings. And therefore, HDB flats and the HDB program is the single most important vehicle and program for the shared prosperity and for the shared, security, economic security for all citizens in terms of Singapore's economic miracle. And therefore, these issues that Swee Yong has raised, these long-term potential crises of asset decay, need for asset protection, of affordability, and of access, just pure access to even rental housing, need to be dealt with if this vehicle for a common sharing of our prosperity is to be maintained into future generations. Okay, therefore I'm going to talk about 5 broad aspects of this. I'm first going to say why these crises, that Swee Yong has brought up, crisis of housing security, crisis of asset insufficiency, retirement adequacy, access, and affordability are inevitable crises the way things currently stand. They are baked in the cake, and unless we do something about it, they will be upon us. Secondly, I'm going to explain that while these solutions that you have just heard seem too good to be true, seem almost like a pipe dream, if you examine them carefully, they're not radical at all. They're actually bold but pragmatic and doable policies that have been done in several other jurisdictions and that we should seriously thinking of doing ourselves. Thirdly, I'm going to explain why the fiscal costs of such an ambitious program, even though it seems so ambitious, is actually eminently affordable, and that with our fiscal resources in the near and the longer term, we can well afford it and still have plenty left over for important social spending in healthcare, housing, social security. I'm also going to talk about how we can it's possible to solve this impossible dilemma between asset protection of high resale flat values and trying to deliver the lowest, most affordable BTO flat possible. I believe the circle can be squared, and I will explain how. And finally, I'm going to enumerate the many macroeconomic ways in which these programs will benefit Singapore. Now, the lease renewal problem is the lease renewal problem is in long-term scenario policy finance what we call a predetermined trend or a predetermined crisis. That means to say, given current trends, it will be almost inevitable that we will get a crisis in housing security, that we will get a crisis in retirement adequacy, that we will get a crisis in elderly poverty, and the reason is as follows. The long-term trend embodied in the Ballas curve, which Swee Yong explains how the asset value after 99 years will inevitably go to zero, no matter how high it gets in the interim. The higher it gets, in fact, the sharper and harder it will have to fall to get to zero. So this is inevitable as death in taxes. Secondly, the glaring fact is that for the bottom 50% of our population, the HDB flat currently forms nearly 90% of net worth. And even by the time they retire, will form 75 to 90% for net worth. Now, the World Bank has told us that capitalizing your real estate is one of the key pillars of retirement adequacy. But in our case, the way that our assets are configured for the bottom 50%, it is not one of the main pillars. It is the only single pillar. And unless you shore up this pillar, there is going to be a crisis in retirement adequacy. Simple as that. Okay? Now, in addition to that, the crisis will be ensured by the fact that the bottom 50% for whom this is true will probably live much longer than we are currently expecting, right? And so the retirement resources will at some point be pushed into a deep crisis over their coming extended lifetimes. Finally, I would mention that right at the bottom 50%, bottom 10% of this 50%, the bottom quartile of this 50% is a hard core of absolute elderly poverty. We're talking about the cardboard collectors, people who do not have enough on a monthly basis to meet their basic needs. Currently, they number some 25 to 30,000 families, but almost inevitably, because of the retirement of poor, low-income baby boomers, this is going to treble over the next 30 years to 75 to 90,000 families. Some nearly 150 to 200,000 people are going to be living in absolute elderly poverty, cardboard collector poverty, HDB cleaner of table, uncle and auntie level of poverty, unless something is done, okay? So this is baked in the cake because it's a demographic trend, given current income trends. And therefore, unless we diffuse what a colleague of mine, a very good friend of mine who is the chief economist and has been a veteran in IMF, chief economist of several international institutions, has called a long-term time bomb with a long fuse. This is a long-term time bomb with a long fuse, and we have to diffuse it. In addition, we know that Singapore is land scarce. In addition, we know that the population is increasing and people are talking even crazy talk about some of our top leaders about a 10 million population. So there's going to be increasingly scarce land and at the same time an increasingly fragmented labor market, right? The means to afford housing. So we have ICT, we have the new technological underemployment from AI that is yet to come, that will make up to 30 to 40% of all jobs, including professional jobs, redundant or drastically changed in form, and could be at drastically lower pays. We have the gig economy. So these are all serious problems. Our flats are aging, our leases are aging, our people are aging and living longer, the poor people are exponentially increasing, and our labor markets are fragmenting over the 30-year horizon. So as things stand, as wonderful as our HDB system is, it is not future ready to meet these trends. Now the proposed proposals, while they seem too good to be true or even utopian, I would argue that they are bold, but they are pragmatic and realistic. Don't forget that the original HDB was far bolder, far more audacious than anything that we are proposing today. And so we are just proposing that we use a fraction of that boldness, a fraction of that audacity to ensure that this HDB continues to serve Singaporeans in the same way. Now, why do I say this? Lease reform and extension is based on internationally established practice. Take the biggest, most liquid, most well-established global real estate market, the UK, London market, right? It has established the UK Leasehold Reform Housing and Urban Renewal Act in 1993 that enables people to quite easily extend for 90 years at a time, their leases, 90 years. We are only proposing 50-year at a time extensions. They can extend, established, they've been doing it since 93, 90 years at a time at a moderate peppercorn ground rent, okay? This is the UK. This is established, number one global real estate, one of the markets in the world. China and Japan too, they have 70-year leases, long leases, China and Hong Kong, that are extended routinely with almost very little cost. This is a small ground rent. So we should, therefore, the policy takeaway from this is extension of leases is not radical. Extension of leases is an established practice to deepen the real estate market on the one hand, and on the other hand, to configure land ownership to best enhance national development and the benefit of all citizens. So we should think of leasehold reform in that way and not as a taboo. It's been done. And we can do it in a way that benefits all citizens. Thirdly, government-funded rebuilding. No, we are saying that it should be done for everybody. We've already done this successfully. The SIRS program has already been successful. The only thing is it's restricted to 4 to 5% effectively of the HDB owning population. Now, with lease reform beyond the 100-year life of HDB flats, there will come a need to rebuild the flats in the middle of your leaseholding period. Question is, who pays for it? Since we have the precedent of SIRS, we propose the government pay for it. And the question is it affordable? Of course, the government shouldn't pay for it if it's not affordable or if it's fiscally irresponsible. But, I mean, I'm going to explain in the next slide how this is eminently affordable. We set up a sinking fund for this purpose. Finally, selling BTO flats at cost brings down, for example, a 3-room flat to $100,000, okay? And this is affordable because Singapore has already done the heavy lifting of acquiring land ownership in Singapore, 80% ownership of Singapore land. They did it through the Land Acquisition Act. That was an extremely radical, by the way, that was an act of land reform unequaled anywhere except in China and North Korea, right? You can't do that today, but we've done that heavy lifting already, and with that asset, we can afford to use the low construction cost that prevailed in the industry. $180 a square foot has been there for the last 10 years because improvements in material technology, improvements in prefabricated technology. We are assuming very conservatively that in the next 100 years, it inflates at 3%, 1% above inflation. Probably not going to do that. But even at that rate, it is eminently affordable. So why don't we do that? Okay. On affordability, the cost of rebuilding that I've just talked about, right? To give free rebuilding to every Singaporean, 50,000 flats, will cost overall a huge amount, a flagship amount of $200 billion, $200 billion. Seems a lot, but if you amortize it over the next 50 to 100 years, and you set up a sinking fund, it turns out you only need $1.5 to $2 billion, maybe $2.5 billion if you want to include building new rental flats, another 100,000 new rental flats. So I'm saying $1.5 to $2.5 billion, 0.3 to 0.4, 0.5% of GDP. This is the fiscal resource that we are talking about. It is eminently affordable. Why? Because we have an effective fiscal surplus, what the IMF calls a structural fiscal surplus, of at least $20 billion currently. What does this $20 billion surplus consist of that is not being counted in current budget accounting? Half of it, or more than half of it, is the land sales to private developers, commercial, industrial, and residential, that should be part of revenues because when government alienates land to private developers, they do so on a 50 to 99-year lease basis, which they get completely back in 50 years and 99 years' time. And therefore, if you amortize it accordingly, this is a renewable fiscal resource. You get the whole thing back after 59, after all, right? So the IMF recognizes this and therefore recognizes this as a legitimate source of revenue. The IMF is no slouch in considering what is and what is not fiscal responsibility, right? They're among the hardest guys out there. And yet we are harder than them, right? We don't count it. But including this resource and including the investment income, we use currently about half of our net investment income under current budget rules. There is the other half, some of it can be used, and if you include that other half and you include all the conservative accounting, we have at least $20 billion. And if you include the 2% GST increase, which seems to be baked in the cake, since none of us can prevent it, you're talking about another $8 to $9 billion, 6 to 7% of GDP, or $20 to $30 billion, of which we need a year, of which we need 1.5 to 2.5. So please tell me if we can afford it or not, okay? So there will be ample fiscal needs left for things like healthcare, education, social security. Now, the key dilemma that we have in one of our proposals is we want to make BTO flats affordable, 3-room flats at 100K, right? Seems like a pipe dream, all right? But The question is, will it infect the prices of resale flats? Can we square the circle, the main contradiction? Can we have our cake and eat? Can we have cheap BTO flats and keep high resale prices still there for people saving, using HDB as a saving asset, right? And we believe the question is yes. We think it is yes because essentially you can do it theoretically if you segment the market. If you segment the market for resale flats and you separate it from the market from BTO flats such that there's very little arbitrage or trading between the two markets. And the way that we've chosen to best segment it is to increase the MOP, the minimum occupancy period, from 5 years to 15 years. 15 years is because 15 years is beyond the 10-year property market cycle. So it will have minimal impact, even though it's a very low price. And don't forget, there's still other premiums that resale flats enjoy. You can choose your exact unit, you can choose on the exact floor with the exact facing. You cannot do that with BTO flats. You can buy your resale flat immediately. There's an immediacy premium. There's a choice of location premium. These, together with a 15-year MOP, should adequately protect resale prices from the much lower BTO prices. Okay, now in addition, why don't people say, okay, when I reach my 15 years, I'm just going to sell and make this huge, windfall gain. Why won't they do that? I would argue that that's unlikely too. Why? Because in our proposals are two embodied options that are very valuable. One is keeping your flat when you reach 65, be able to trade it down for the second bite of the cherry, for yet another BTO flat at cost, right? So you need to have that flat in hand. You can't just sell it straight away. Secondly, keeping that flat as a bequest, because don't forget, it is 100% going to be sersed to the best, highest standard of housing available in the future, right? So these are important optionalities embedded in our proposals that will ensure that people don't just sell and dump, these new BTO flats once they reach resale conditions. So they will protect the value of resale flats. And the housing market the private market is similarly going to be protected. As you know, the resale market forms the basis for the private housing market. So if that is stable, private housing market should be stable. Also, the private housing market can easily be supported through relaxing current cooling measures or relaxing our foreign investor measures. And I think our policy concerns are not with how expensive private property gets. Very honestly, we want to cater to the affordability of 80% of our population within the public housing sphere. So I think that will be fine. Finally, I just want to say, at macroeconomic levels, I just want to reiterate, they will help ensure retirement adequacy and housing security. They will alleviate absolute poverty both at the elderly level, because they protect their assets from decay, and because they allow a second bite of the cherry. They will alleviate absolute poverty at the working level, even for the working poor, because the cheap rental flats will ensure people who now earn a wage that's below the living wage to have access to cheap housing, one of the biggest ticket items for monthly expenditure. It will boost long-term growth and productivity because, and this is a clear point for macroeconomists, because without needing this high unnecessary savings that you would otherwise have to have for your flats, you have more available for consumption, for investment, for entrepreneurship, et cetera, and therefore for growth and demand. And overall, it will provide social protection for the smooth transition of the transformation to the globally competitive smart city. Now, you heard Swee Yong talk about globally competitive smart city. It is essentially the optimal configuration of where you live, where you work, the residential, commercial, industrial, amalgamated with the ideal logistics, the ideal transportation, the ideal infocoms, making it a smart city with a much higher level of productivity. And we can do this with our entire workforce, whereas most other countries cannot. Okay? But the problem is, when you relocate 80% of your population in this way, and if you expect them to go to great hardship in terms of having insufficient retirement assets in terms of having to have even elderly poverty as you relocate them. There is no guarantee that there will not be a lot of social resistance to this massive relocation. So for this reason, an adequate social protection or safety net is very necessary when you attempt to do large-scale restructuring for economic benefit, like they did in Sweden. They restructured all the Swedish shipyards, and they relocated all that labor into other industries very quickly because they had a social safety net that enabled that. And this, our proposals, is the social safety net that will enable this transition to our smart cities. So, our proposals therefore amount to really alleviating hardship, really increasing security and well-being. They amount to a new social compact in public housing, a new social compact of the kind that we all enjoyed with the first generation of PAP leaders. Pretty much the same in today's age, translated into to meet today's challenges. And just as it did for the first generation PAP government, by resolving these current problems, these current contradictions of asset erosion, asset protection, accessibility, affordability, we can achieve these. We can strengthen social well-being and even national identity, I believe. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the regeneration of our island city-state from its current, from the current interregnum, I would call it. What has been said by Swee Yong and Lam Kiong basically, to me, lays out the foundation, the new foundation, without which I think moving to the next stage of Singapore's development, given the uncertainties and difficulties that we are going to face, is going to be difficult. But I think if we set the foundation correctly, I think we can do very well. First, let me just say that I have really no personal interest in the resuscitation or retention of the asset value of HDB flats, because I own one and I live in one. And I never intend to sell. And at one time, I had actually thought of, in fact, I discussed with some of my political friends that to solve the HDB asset decline problem, we should turn them all into condominium. Meaning that everyone should be given a strata title. But on deeper thought, since I had already run a condominium before, I can tell you it's no fun. Because, for two reasons. One, the perception of the flat owners are very, very small and very, very selfish. Therefore, they do not see the bigger picture, and they do not want to see the bigger picture. That leads to the second point, that unless housing is regarded as a national project, we can never use housing as an instrument for the advancement and modernization of our society. And that means that housing must be a public sector project. However, there are modalities that need to be addressed. My personal experience of living in an HDB estate, I must say, over the last 12 years, has been a fantastic experience. Very gratifying, because every day I meet little toddlers like this. They high-five with me, they have eye contact with me, they talk to me, they smile at me. It's incredible, right? And this is the kind of society that we want to be. And actually, it actually happens. But for some reason, as these kids grow up and get decimated by the education system, they become Singaporeans. So I think one of the greatest achievements of the Singapore government under the PAP has been the public housing program. And I think that it is really a very, very radical program, and that has contributed greatly to the position that Singapore is in. And learning from Hong Kong, I think is quite obvious. So what I'm going to talk about is really that we not only have to be a livable city, of which we are justly proud, we need to go beyond livability. We need to be able to live, to work, to learn, to play, to farm, and to heal all together. What does this mean? This means that we must have multi-function human settlements, okay? And the reason why we are going to have to rebuild our human settlements, our cities, our housing estates, is because no engineer will certify the structural stability of a building, of a reinforced concrete building, beyond 100 years. Because in the engineering code, engineers design buildings, reinforced concrete buildings, only for 100 years. Why? Because of what is called carbonation. When we have increased CO2 in the atmosphere, and in the tropical situation, the CO2 mixes with rainwater, becomes carbonic acid, which seeps into the concrete, which is only 5 centimeters from the surface. The steel bar is 5 centimeters from the surface of the concrete. Any small fracture in the concrete fissures, the carbonic acid will go in and corrode the steel bar. And that is why no engineer will certify the reinforced concrete beyond 100 years. And therefore, even when we increase the lease of the property, right, by another 50 years or 100 years, we still have to demolish after a period of 100 years. So therefore, rebuilding is necessary for all our HDB flats over a period of time. Now, this is the situation we have. This is our master plan. Our master plan is planned by town planners who are trained in Australia, Britain, and United States, where they have huge amounts of land. And all the town planning literature and all the town planning methodologies are based on land use planning. That means we put factories here, we put housing here, we put urban functions here, and so on. This is called 2D planning. For a small island city-state like Singapore, we need a different methodology. We have to move to 3D planning, right? What does 3D planning mean? There are a number of critical issues here. If Singapore is going to become an intelligent island city-state with intelligent people, we need to introduce 3D planning into our existing housing estates. These are the yellow ones. The yellow ones are our existing housing estates. These red lines here are what I call the central nervous system. What is a central nervous system? And we can only build a central nervous system when we progressively demolish existing buildings. And this is an inevitability, that's what we are arguing. The central nervous system consists of schools upstairs, shops, workplaces, civic functions, cultural functions, artistic functions downstairs. Students in the 21st century must be learning and studying in the busiest places and not in quiet places, which all our present schools are in the wrong places. They should all be demolished. The reason why we want children to study in the 21st century students to study in the active areas is so that they not only become book smart, they become life smart. That is the future. If we have people who grow up not life smart, this country has no future. So when you link up all the nervous systems together, the whole island becomes a brain. Okay? It becomes a connected synaptic system. What does that mean? Singapore's future is to be the Boston of Asia. Boston in the United States has got 65 universities and institutions of higher learning. It attracts the best and brightest from the whole world to live and study in Boston. And that is where you have the MIT, you have the Boston University, you have Harvard University, and so on. It is the brain center of the world. Singapore, if we introduce the nervous system into Singapore as a university city, in other words, the whole of Singapore becomes a campus city where the smartest and brightest in Asia can come and study here, live with our own students, we will become an incredibly productive island city-state. I'm afraid that our government has not sold the idea well enough to our people. People grumble, why are we giving so many scholarships to foreigners? It is very strategic. We must think about it this way. If you apply the 2% rule on any society, 2% of any society are exceptional people. 2% of 600 million Southeast Asians in ASEAN means there are 12 million exceptional people. If we can attract 1 million of them to live and study in Singapore together with our exceptional people in Singapore, this will be the brain center of Southeast Asia. And this is our future. Okay? So this is very crucial. On the issue of multifunctional building, 3D planning, this is the image. You live upstairs in flats, and on the ground floor, you connect it all up with one gigantic podium. This is the gigantic podium that stretches from Pandan Reservoir up to Marina South, Marina East. Okay? In my calculation, we can house 2 million people here. Right? 2 million people, not just housing, right? Because in 3D planning, let me give you the simple arithmetic. The total amount of floor space per person in Singapore is 50 square meters per person. Our planners don't understand this at all because they're only interested in land area, okay? Because of 2D planning. In 3D planning, you must know what is the total amount of floor area every human being needs to live a decent life, economically progressive life. 25 square meters per person is what we need for housing, right? So typically our houses are about 100 square meters, 4 persons, right? 3 Singaporeans and 1 Filipino maid. Because everybody occupies floor space. So therefore it's 25 square meters per person. And that is half the total amount of floor space. You'll be surprised. I had a meeting with Jurong Town Corporation, and they gave me the total amount of floor area of all the factories that they own. And they own half the total amount of factories in Singapore. Okay? And when they gave me their number, I divided by the population, they fell off the chair because the total floor area per person for factories is only 3 square meters for JTC. So in other words, it's 6 square meters for all forms of factories per person, right? Then you add schools, you add hospitals, you add shopping centers, offices, and everything. And I got the figures from, the only comparable figure I could get was from Fairfax County in Washington, D.C., where they have 2 aerospace industries. They have George Mason University, and many of the back office functions from Washington town itself. So the total floor area of non-residential floor area in the most productive and most advanced, most developed county in United States is 20 square meters per person, right? So obviously, a high-functioning economy like Singapore and Fairfax County will be about 50 to 60 square meters per person. Now, if you were to look at, if you take the total number of people in Singapore for simple arithmetic as 5 million people, okay? 5 million times 20, times 50 square meters per person is 250 million square meters. And if you say, for easy calculation, the total island is 750 million square meters, and if you just compact everything into a one-story building, back to back, no ventilation, no light, nothing, right? It will only cover 1/3 of the island. If it is two-story, it will cover 1/6 of the island. If it is a 4-story building, it will be 1/12 of the island. If it's 8-story, it will be 1/24. In other words, the planning options in Singapore are enormous, much more than our planners think. I think our planners are fundamentally incompetent. So this is the crucial question that Singaporeans must ask ourselves. How do we use the land? And we have a tremendous advantage because 80% of the total land area in Singapore is owned by us, by the state. Therefore, we can do things that no other country can do, which means that we can use our land and use our planning methodology, right, to do things like this, right? I see the southern intensification, I see the redevelopment of all the housing estates and how to turn the whole of the island into a tremendously vibrant, intellectual, cultural, and economic, the best economic city in the world. And if we did it rightly, like in this project, which is a project which I did together with the Singapore Institute of Architects in 1992, that is, what is it? 27 years ago, okay? That if we have high-level shading with photovoltaic panels, right? Low-level shading and with compact urban form, right? We can reduce the temperature of the city, which is going to be a major issue as the urban temperature rises with the heat island effect that is exacerbated by the compaction of the city. So in other words, we have the conceptual tools, we have the land, but we need the imagination and we need the kind of political will and the daring, right? We need to really kick the bureaucrats in the butt to get things going, right? And now let me tell you one more thing. Young architects who studied with me in NUS, now in URA, just told me a few days ago that they proposed the introduction of a central nervous system into one of the huge new developments that's coming up in the Paya Lebar Airport, that land that's going to be vacated. And MOE were the ones who killed it. They objected to it. MOE are still living in the 19th century because they do not understand that students today must learn not only to be book smart, but must learn to be life smart, which means that the schools must be an integral part of the city. Thank you very much.
So, okay, let me get 3 questions from here first. Please just state your name and then ask your question. And we might take 3 questions first, then we get the panel to answer. Push the switch, push it up. Okay, it's working now.
Yeah, my name is Kevin Aoyong, professor at the Singapore Institute of Technology. My question relates to your 4 suggestions, and I think these are good suggestions. I have one more additional suggestion, a 5th suggestion. as we know, okay, old people, they do not like to move from their house. So buying and selling a house is a big decision. And if you ask a typical, 65 years old, couple, they would prefer to stay in their house. And I'm just wondering what do you think of reverse mortgage? So we understand that the banks, the local banks, prohibit reverse mortgages for HDB flats, and we also understand that the reverse mortgages does have its own pitfall, especially if you utilize that. But if you just use, for example, say 10-20% of your equity value, so in other words, if you have a HDB flat which is like $500,000, and you use reverse mortgage to get maybe $100,000 to help them with their daily spending needs. So just wondering what you think of this idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, please. Right next to him. Sorry, right next to him. So the first question was about reverse mortgages. Kush.
I'm Kush Chopra. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, and I'm sure we will have lots to think about and talk about in the days to come. My question is has to do with what seems to me to be a little inherent contradiction between the idea of lease renewal and carbonation and a 100-year life cycle for the building. Am I right in thinking that there seems to be a contradiction here?
Thank you. That's a good question. The answer is no, but I'll let them explain why. No contradiction, I mean. Next to him, yeah.
Yeah, my name is Charles. Thank you for letting me ask a question. Some months ago, this year, there was a bridge or viaduct in Italy that actually crashed. And subsequently, the engineers said that concrete oxidizes and loses strength within anything from 60 years onwards. I remember that quite clearly, even though I was hoping to hear from some of the engineers in Singapore through the media what were their thoughts. So now you have one other postulation, which is that concrete lasts for 100 years. Regardless whether it's 60 years, 50 years, or 100 years, there is a finite time to concrete structures. So which I think neither the government nor anybody else has considered carefully, which of course I think has many implications for whatever we are talking about. Then the other point I would like to check is the speakers mentioned there were 1,050,000 HDB houses currently, and it takes at the standard of $180 per square feet. You should be able to build a house, a unit quite easily for 180,000, say 200,000, leading to the 200 billion Singapore dollar figure, subject to inflation increments. Would that be a correct summary? So I didn't realize that, but I thought then the idea becomes very interesting, very, like you say, eminently feasible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please pass the mic to the person directly behind you. But before that person speaks, thank you. Yes, this issue has been addressed, and we will respond to it again. The cost is right, $200 billion over 100 years. Next question, and that'll be the last question for this time, and we'll have the panel answer.
Good afternoon. My name is Lou. Thank you very much for a very, very enlightening sharing. My question are two. The first one is that we talk about affordabilities, because if the land for the public sectors, housing sectors, are to be borne by the government, I'm just wondering, will it affect the land sales to the private developers? Therefore, the government revenue will drop, and will it therefore make, can the government afford to fund the public housing's regionalizations? The second question is that there's often mentioned by some government officials, especially the old school one, that when people are renting their home, they don't really care about the environments and they abuse it and it may become a ghetto. I'm just wondering whether that will happen in Singapore, and if so, what do the panels think, what can be done to prevent that from happening? Right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Please pass the mic back to the... Okay, so we have 4 questions. Reverse mortgage, question of carbonization and the concrete age, and then the related question on that, and finally the rental flats, ghettoization of precincts. So who wants to respond?
Why don't you deal with the...
Well, just deal with the carbonation issue. The problem of carbonation is for reinforced concrete structures. Non-reinforced concrete structures, purely concrete structures, like the Coliseum Dome in Rome. Concrete without steel inside can last thousands of years. Yes, but when you have steel inside, then it's the steel that corrodes.
Okay, I've got about the reverse mortgage using, say, 10% of today's 500,000 equity, take out the cash, is similar to the Lease Buyback Scheme. And this one had a few discussions around this topic during our national conversation on housing around the year 2012. Minister Khaw Boon Wan got it going. And the take-up rate apparently is low, similar to Lease Buyback Scheme, because this generation of above 65-year-olds, usually profile of the couple is one is a homemaker, the other one is the income earner. So much so that they don't actually have sufficient retirement sum in the CPF. So if you were to give them 100,000 back from the equity of their homes, actually most of this doesn't come to them as cash. And so they then top up their CPF retirement accounts and they get an additional sum monthly, which most of them find is not worthwhile. And then dealing with these older HDBs that today the equity value is 500,000, so we release them 10% of the 500,000, but in 10 years' time, this flat's value is no more 500,000, it may drop to 300,000, and then does the bank then suffer any write-downs and risks on their books? So, yeah, but that 10 or 20% is of a shrinking value. So these too many moving parts for a private multinational to take care of. It still has to come back to the responsibility of the government, which is HDB. Another point that I wanted to address is whether if we expanded the rental scheme, would it become a ghetto? So today, do you know that you're not allowed to keep one cat in a HDB flat? The HDB tenancy agreement is much tighter than, in fact, a private residential housing tenancy agreement. And if we were to run it well, as well as behave well, be good neighbors to each other, it shouldn't. The country that we most aspire to, the Swiss model, Switzerland's home ownership is 40%. 60% of them are renters, and they've got very good tenancy agreements that protect the rights of the tenants. Developed nations like Japan, USA, Australia, home ownership is about 65%. 35% of them are tenants. Then, other than the Bronx, I can't think of any other ghettos.
Thanks. I think in terms of the lease buyback or reverse mortgage schemes, the LBS is quite a good scheme. The problem is that it has been very unpopular. The take-up rate since 10 years ago of the LBS is only 3,100 units, okay, after 10 years. And the principal reason seems to be that because we are Asians, we do want to have some bequest left to the next generation. If LBS scheme, by definition, you give back, you stay until you die and you give back the last remaining 30 years to the government, you sell it back to the government, leaving nothing for your descendants. So this seems to be really unpopular with people, even though it does make financial sense. And the problem is that you've got to catch it early, because if you have still 60 years left, you can say, okay, I retire, I have 30 years to live, I sell the last 30 years. But if you own an older flat, then that option is not there. You don't have enough runway to do that, right? And so the proposals that we have, you will see, leave a significant bequest in all scenarios, right? First of all, in the scenario where you keep the flat and you keep it, you extend the lease, you get it renewed, you have a SERS, and with the SERS, I think Swee Young didn't mention just now, you get a new 99-year lease, right, with the SERS. With that, you have something that is almost perpetually being renewed and perpetually, potentially within your family. Okay, so that is a perpetual request. However, a lot of them will be sold. Okay, as people have more than one kid, so when you pass away, you need to divide the inheritance. You do need to actually, many people cannot afford to keep the whole amount as a bequest. They need to take the second bite of the cherry. They need to downsize, capitalize on it for their retirement. So for that reason, even if they do so, the second bite of the cherry, we hope that they will be given a 99-year leasehold built to order, which will still leave significant residual value for bequest. So hopefully this will be a more popular.
Okay, Kush's point is there a contradiction between, on the one hand, we are proposing that after 50 years, you get a renewal of, you set back the clock another 99 years. And that's the proposal. But the point is that at the 100-year mark, your flat is going to be structurally unsound. Indeed. And so the response to that is, before the 100-year mark, we have to rebuild your flat. And that is part of the proposal. The flat will be rebuilt with 99 years, and the person who's bearing who bears the cost of this rebuilding is the government. That's what's going to cost the $200 billion. That's what's going to amortize over 100 years, cost $1.5 to $2.5 billion a year, and that's what is affordable.
Very quickly to that, the renewal of the lease in a 50-year block brings it beyond the structural life of the house that you're in. So in 50 years, when you use up 50 years of that newly renewed 100-year lease, you're going to have to get out and get it entirely rebuilt and come back for the next 50 years. But you'll come back to a fresh 99-year lease, because this gives the opportunity to give every single citizen a SERS effectively. Right? SERS now is a prerogative only 5%. SERS now is only done on a planning basis with the planner's interest in mind. Right?
Only for the PAP ward.
Well, I don't think so. I think they just look at wards that are potentially most commercially rewarding to rebuild on. And so they're driven by commercial reward to do SERS planning. It ends up, you only get 5% SERS. But in this instance, we want it to be centered on HDB dwellers' needs, not the planner's needs. And so if we reverse that, then every HDB dweller, if we extend the lease to support their asset values, will need a SERS. And therefore, since it is affordable, I repeat, since it is affordable, every HDB owner should have a SERS. And this enables the complete reconfiguration of Singapore into a smart city as taken, because you are rebuilding the entire housing stock every 100 years, right? You are reshaping Singapore's, all our HDB dwellings into a location that is optimal for everybody. No other country can do that.
Let me please see a show of hands for the next set of questions. One there, one there, one there, one there. Okay, I think we'll go this part first. Right. Okay. Yeah. Please, first row. Yeah.
Thank you. So actually, a couple of questions. Firstly, with the renewals of the lease as well as
A quick identify.
My name is Glenn Yong. Work in the private sector. So, firstly, with the extensions of the lease as well as the rebuilding, does that reduce social mobility? Hypothetical example: a family with a 3-room flat will get this extra 50 or 100 years on a 3-room flat. Family with a 5-room flat will get, or mention that will get 50 or 100 years in this larger ticket item, right? So effectively, everybody's net worth doubles, but the one with more gets more, right? And second question, I think our national obsession is clearly real estate, but I think our national problem is TFR. Have you guys thought about what the impact of all your proposals would be in totality on TFR?
Thank you. Next question. Okay, yes, please.
Okay, I'm Kevin. Actually, I've got again 2 questions. And actually maybe I'm even going a bit outside the box. But instead of just looking at a housing market as a standalone, how about minimum wages and say a retirement income for say people above 70? Wouldn't this be a more direct way of addressing retirement adequacy? Ensuring that people have enough to save. And that's my first question. And secondly, do you think the lease system is a little too complicated and also kind of defeats the purpose of having a 99-year lease in the first place? After all, the reason why these leases come out is you do not want, say, situations like in some countries where the nobility end up owning 90% of, say, the capital city. And, by just allowing all these automatic lease extensions, you can create this sort of situation. Yep, thanks.
Hi, this is Louis Chua here. I just got a question, which I think Mr. Yeo Lam Keong mentioned about the key dilemma between the asset protection and affordability. So while I get that actually to have affordable HDB BTO flats, that's great. And I do see that because of the 15-year MOP period, it's hard for them to see a so-called windfall. But for the other way round, for the 1 million existing HDB stock, which on average is about 400-500K now, how do we sort of, in a way, prevent that loss or erosion in value for the existing stock of home buyers, especially when we are looking at eventually having SIRS for everybody. And at this point in time, the value of SIRS is basically tied to the value of the flats, the resale flats. So just on the other way around, how does it work for the existing home buyers?
Okay, shall we take those questions? Right, okay, let's take those 3 questions.
I want to talk about this issue of social mobility, which is a good point, right? So the questions out there are, will automatic lease renewal and automatic rebuilding lead to lack of social mobility within the HDB sector, right? In other words, those owning 5-room flats, those owning 4-room flats will have advantage over those having 3-room flats, and will have 5-room flats already stuck within the family for generations, and nobody else can get those 5-room flats, right? I would say that there is some tendency towards that, but it's mitigated by many factors that should not end up in aggregate being a social mobility problem. Now, what are the factors? Okay. Now, first of all, don't forget, we are making accessibility of the new 5-room flats much cheaper than they ever were, right? So new 5-room flats, new 4-room flats will be much cheaper now because they're being sold at cost. And so the entry level for a 5-room flat is going to be much easier. And that is the essence of social mobility. Entry level by a newcomer to the market, right? He buys a 4-room flat. After a while, within that 15 period, he can sell back to the HDB and upgrade to a 5-room flat before he reaches his 15-year MOP. So that's one factor. The other factor is that there will be an automatic recycling of these flats because a lot of them need to take that second bite of the cherry. They need to sell that flat in order to realize the capital value of that flat for their retirement. They can't just hang on. Very few families, except the richer ones, will be able to hang on to it, as a family heirloom, as it were. And also, don't forget that when they eventually pass away, depends how many kids they have. They just have one kid, yes, that's true. That's where you get that ossification. But if they have two kids, how are you going to divide it? You have to sell the flat to divide it among the two kids, right? And so selling that flat then enables someone else to buy it. So there are these automatic, and finally I would say that the main problem of social mobility in Singapore, if you want to think about the problem of inequality in social mobility, is not really between the 5-room flatters and the 4-room flatters and the 3-room flatters. It is between HDB holders and owners of private property. That is the biggest social immobility barrier that we have to worry about, right? Not within HDB. That is a second order social mobility problem. Okay, thank you.
I'm not answering the others. Oh, to add on to Lam Kiong's point is, social mobility can come about if you started at 3-room flat with $100,000, but you have got a lot more cash and CPF that you can accumulate. And of course, with a fantastic education system that we have, you should be able to wisely invest the excess cash and that your CPF continues to accumulate your 2.5%, such that by the time you retire, actually you do have a pile of savings on the side that you can enjoy.
I'd also like to talk about finding social mobility right at the bottom. So you're taking the people who are in absolute poverty today, the bottom 10%, right? As they are today, because they have insufficient rental housing, the basic housing needs are not taken care of, it is these people that experience the most egregious social mobility. What happens to them? They become an underclass. They become an ossified underclass. In Singapore, we are in the process of forming an ossified underclass. I mean, look at the previous sessions that people had with the PMD drivers, right? You can see the formation of an underclass, and you can see the uncomfortable racial composition of that underclass, right? So our proposals that will give these people access to cheap rental housing with security of tenure, right, will give them that kind of platform, the best platform to actually, that trampoline, as Taman Shah Mugaran like to say, to get out of that lowest of absolute mobility, to escape social mobility. Finally, I'd like to talk about TFR. You asked what is the impact on TFR, which is the total the population replacement, right? I think affordable flats for young couples, 50 to 60% cheaper, plus more assured retirement adequacy, right, is going to increase TFR, definitely, and not lower it. Now, the gentleman Kevin made a good point. Why don't we address, pension adequacy problems more directly with pension subsidies, with direct subsidies to the poor? My point is, we need both. If you look at this is only one half of the pension adequacy story. Okay, so in the World Bank scheme, capitalizing real estate is one pillar of retirement adequacy. The other pillars of retirement adequacy are your private savings, your state pension, and your part-time work. So these are the 4 pillars that we're only talking about one pillar here. If we want to talk about real pension adequacy for Singaporeans, we also have to talk about CPF reform. We also have to talk about adequacy of the silver support scheme, the non-contributory pension to the poor. Just because we have it, does it obviate the need for a higher silver support scheme payout? No, you probably need both, right? So this is only 1/4 of the story, 1/2 of the story, but it is a big component because for the bottom 50%, it forms 75 to 90%, currently 90% of the pension asset. Okay. What will be the impact of existing resale flats of our reform? I think existing resale flats, if anything, should gain in value. So imagine you're a resale flat right now, right? And you have a 30-year-old resale flat. Suddenly, you will have the prospect that in another 20 years, you can extend your lease, as a matter of policy practice, by another 50 years, right? And on top of that, if you hang on to that, you will get an automatic SERS, right? So this will mean, I think, that all resale flats, the prices, first of all, will be supported, will not be threatened by the BTO prices. If anything, they will experience a mild appreciation, a modest appreciation, I think 10%, in some cases 20%, because they are now effectively, if you think about it, this is a rolling freehold scheme, right? You're effectively rolling the extensions of leasehold to effectively form a freehold asset. So if you suddenly had a leasehold asset, suddenly you have an effective freehold asset, there is going to be some appreciation. Thank you.
Okay, next round of questions. Terry, do you still have a question? No. Okay, let's take from that side of the room.
Hi, I'm Wei Long, not economist, nobody, but and I don't intend to pour cold water, but I'm just quite curious if the description seems to be like we're going for broke. You made a comment that we're going to be a nerve center. In this regard, you're going to have a very glorious future. Our HDB resale will go up. I think you mentioned it that because you're promising extra 100 years or 50 years, whatever the case, going to build it up. So my concern is that as societies grows, they also may decay or they may just die and become extinct. Are you heralding the extinction of Singapore? And the question I'm driving at, or the scenario I'm painting, is that in going for broke and having a lot of exciting outcomes for the HDB, would some Singaporeans also then decide to migrate? If at any state, let's say a dark scenario happens, just as we are planning for like a bomb happening, not if but when, which is repeated by our cabinet. So let's say the Prime Minister of Singapore gets shot dead, something like that happens, then would a sudden sale and or exodus of citizens or something of that matter happen, then what are we still going to renew these HDB flats? And with a high price, do we get outprice of Singapore? And in that sense, what's the insurance scheme of this glorious building plan that we become the nerve center, and should we not arrive at that state? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. The one behind.
Hi, my name is Wayne. I just want to ask that I read that the purpose of the lease top-up is to sustain the secondary resale market so that there is no lease decay issue. And then concurrently, there's this promise of a 100-year renewal, which, like you said, essentially it becomes confirmed SERS. So if there is confirmed SERS, and we had this scenario before Lawrence Wong said that magical things that he said in 2017, the promise of confirmed SERS will actually sustain the market in itself. So why do we need to top up the lease then? Maybe not 100 years, and we just say that it will be renewed every 99 years to coincide with the lease period. Then the promise of SERS, the promise of redevelopment, would itself guarantee that the resale market will not crash. Yeah, that is my question.
Thank you. Okay, there's a question behind there.
Hi, my name is Isaac. I just want to bring up this question. When you say you plans to rebuild the HDB flats due to carbonation, does that include executive apartments and mansionettes also? Because those, they have a lockup value of like a much higher value than the 3 or 4 room flats. Yeah. Then the second question is what is the current construction cost of a BTO, new BTO flat?
Okay, thank you. Let's take those 3 questions.
Easiest and fastest to answer, what's the current construction cost? These numbers are not published. You guys seem surprised. However, there are indicative sources. We can get quantity surveyors' cost reports for constructing average grade or luxury grade housing units. And so our $180 per square foot seems to be on the high side. And based on construction companies that are listed on stock exchange, whenever they bid and they win a HDB project, the bid price and their winning price of say 110 million to construct how many hundred new HDB flats, we can work the numbers backwards to do an estimate on the construction cost. Again, $180 per square foot is on the high side. It can be as low as some of the larger ones can go below 150. Yeah. So we are using 180 to be conservative to make sure that HDB will not be losing money selling it to us at $180 per square foot. And then, Wei Leong, is it, you asked about the central nervous system. The fact that we can rebuild a HDB town into a mixed use with higher value, the act of rebuilding it actually raises the intrinsic land value that the site sits on, so that an uplift in land value actually adds on to our national reserves already. And if we can proudly announce to the entire world that, look, every 4 years we have one brand new town with the latest fiber optics, communications, transport technology, and comfort built into that town, we would automatically be able to attract good talent to come here. So of course, there can be calamities. No country is without one. But I think that we would then put ourselves at a higher probability of sustaining ourselves as a world-leading city if we do not embark on this transformation and we still stick to our old thinking. I think then the calamity, the dead society situation that you're describing is going to be more highly probable.
Thank you. That's a good answer. I think I'd like to address the answer of why do we need to go through all these complicated 50-year renewals when you can just say, oh, announce, right? Everybody will get a SERS. Why don't we have a 99 years, when we announce automatic renewal of 99-year lease at the end of 99 years, right? So when we do that, now that was the question, right? And I think, yes, in theory that is possible, but what we need to affect is market pricing, right? Market pricing of flats. And markets are is a skeptical animal. If you say, I will give you SERS 100%, you know, when you need it in 150 to 100 years time when your flat, you know, expires, who is going to be around to hold you accountable to it, right? You can promise, yeah, in 50 years, 100 years time, you're not going to be around to deliver on that. Will the market believe that? That's the key question, right? Whereas, similarly, if you say, I renew your thing at the end of 99 years, well, we'll wait and see, right? The market will not price it in until the first one is renewed. Whereas if you say, after 50 years, we will reprice back 50 years to a 99-year lease. There are already many flats in the market that are already 60 years old. They will qualify first. Once we announce this, they will automatically get the top-up. Once they get the top-up, you cannot not renew the others, right? So the market will price it in because for the market, seeing is believing. Okay? So that is why we designed it in this manner. Thank
you. I just want to address one aspect of the central nervous system, right? When you have multi-functions, if you have housing on top and commercial below, you need to also have what we call differential pricing. Now, let me give you one simple example. From 1968, when I designed People's Park Complex, the tower block, which was required by URA at that time, that in the redevelopment, we must have so many units of housing. At that time, the housing market in Chinatown was very, very doubtful, right? And how would we then price the flats? So we price it minus land costs. The land costs being taken care of by the commercial podium. So similarly, in any redevelopment, we need to have differential pricing, right? For example, if in the project that I showed you with the flats on top and the podium below, and in the podium there, for example, there might be a school. Obviously, the school is not going to be able to pay market rates. So therefore, we need to have segmented differential pricing. So these are the kind of innovations that are necessary to come along with the new development ideas. Yeah, about private properties in reinforced concrete. Reinforced concrete doesn't bother whether you are a private property or a. Yeah. It will just deteriorate just like any other reinforced concrete structure.
Okay. Last two rounds. I've exceeded the 5 o'clock, but last two rounds. Damien, do you have a question? Yeah. Please put your hand so that. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm Damien. Very quickly, what is the main or strongest counter argument to your proposal, and are there any in between or compromise alternatives? If there is one thing that the proposal cannot do without, or one or two things that the proposal cannot do without, what is that? And I'd also like to ask, what is the cost? Because Lam Kiong spoke about an impending crisis. What is the cost of the alternative of doing nothing or implementing a different proposal to yours, both in physical and non-physical terms? Thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Bernard here, property agent. So my question is about, because we often talk about, when I talk to clients, they always talk about, oh, I buy this flat, what's the plans for the next 10 years or so, that kind of thing. Between the younger couple and the older couple. Like recently I met one old guy. He said to me, Bernard, I'm going to buy this flat to the day I die. And I hope to leave this to my children. Then I look at him and ask him what's his motivation and all that. Cut a long story short, he's worried about whether the flat still has value. So he moved on to freehold. But I'm trying to tell him that freehold versus leasehold has little difference for the land. So that's one thing, but he still don't believe because he feel that, if this sales versus verse is like a time bomb, which one to choose with a longer time fuse. So how do you convince the lay people about this plan, so to speak? Is it viable? And also because of national security, we allow immigrants to come in here, then will they feel incentivized to stay committed to this place called Singapore, or would they just so-called cash out? Yeah, some of the locals are also saying, maybe sell out this and move to JB, for example, where it's cheaper.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Over there, Sun Ming.
Yeah, hi. This being the home of kiasunas, I just like to address the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the fear of change and the ability to change. So where any kind of social change, as you know, is frightening, and some of the questions actually, this might be beyond your remit, but actually I'd like to hear more about the 3D idea that King Soon was talking about, and how one long podium can actually affect that. It seems like it's going to take more, and it looks like more forums like this actually might be in the planning to actually help achieve that. So something more on this would be great.
Thank you. Okay, let's answer this question, then we'll have a final round.
On the long podium, it's a very interesting question, because if you look at our existing commercial developments and also our HDB, there's a tremendous amount of wasted land in between the plots, because the planning requirement is that every development must have a margin of space between one development and another, right? So if you have a continuous podium, right, then you are actually saving a lot of land. And in my calculation, actually, you'll be surprised that, for example, if you go to the YouTube video which I posted on the modular city concept, you will be shocked that for 7 million people in Singapore, we can triple the amount of green space in Singapore. So this is the kind of planning methods that are so out of date that we really need to review.
So the question is, what would be the counter argument to, a counter argument to these reforms? I guess the most obvious counter-argument is do nothing, lah. Right? So, but as I explained, if you do nothing, because our flats are aging, because our leases are running out, because people are living longer, because the number of absolute elderly poor will treble in the next 30 years, because our labor markets of the future will inevitably become more disjointed, right? And dysfunctional. Because of all these things, then do nothing means we are going to have a crisis. We are inevitably going to have a crisis in.
Have old people demonstrating in the streets.
Yeah. So it's a recipe. So a good friend of mine called it a long-term time bomb with a long fuse. He was a senior director in the IMF. He's not making a light comment, right? Senior director in the IMF, and he's the chief economist. He was the chief economist of one of our leading governance institutions. Okay, so he didn't make this comment lightly. There is a long-term crisis baked in the cake if we do nothing. What are the other alternatives? There have been other alternatives. The Workers' Party has come up with an alternative. Last night, they came out last night. The SDP has come up with another alternative. They came out with that a long time ago, right? So for the SDP, they would have all flats being bought and sold at cost only to the HDB. And that's the SDP model, right? For the Workers' Party, just came out last night, and we welcome them to the debate because it's great that they sat down and did a really thorough, rigorous, careful, detailed analysis of the problem, and they came up with their own solutions, and they're valid solutions. So they want, for example, they're recommending that HDB be a buyer of last resort at the 70-year-old level. They call it a universal lease buyback scheme, right? They're calling for affordability of flats being linked to income as opposed to being sold at cost. So that's their proposal, right? They're calling for. They said it's not practical to have universal SIRS because it's too expensive, logistics are too difficult. So have as much SIRS as possible. Okay, so these are all reasonable arguments. And these are the kinds of arguments that we should be having both with interested parties as well as with the authorities. This is the kind of informed, researched, well-considered debate on key issues that we desperately need to have. So while we don't agree with the SDP model or entirely with the WP model, we think ours is better. For example, we think that we should deal with the problem of leasehold erosion at the 50-year mark. Why wait till the 70-year mark? And why? And it's going to be expensive. You expect if you expect the HDB to the buyer of last resort at a reasonable price, and when the flat is 70 years old, they're going to be spending a lot of money, right? If you just alter the leasehold laws, the market supports the value of your resale price for free. Okay, so I mean, we can argue the costs and benefits of various. That is a reasonable argument. I'm not poo-pooing the argument. I'm saying the pros and cons of each argument, and we should have them. That's why at the beginning we said this is not the last word. By no means in this debate. This is just, we hope, a rigorous and well thought out first step, but to consider a foundation to solve these key problems. What are the problems? Leasehold erosion, asset protection, affordability, accessibility. When all these long-term trends, the fragmentation of the labor market, aging, increase of the poor, the inevitable law of Bala's table, all these long-term things are happening and threatening, the integrity of our housing development board system.
So Bernard has one question about how to persuade the old gentleman client of his that a 99-year HDB still has value as compared to if he wanted to go and buy a freehold flat. If our proposals were accepted, it creates a cushion of drop in floor prices because of the extension of the lease and because of the guaranteed rebuilding or SIRS. So we are not saying that our proposal, if enacted, will definitely remove prices from dipping, because we are not interested to create the alternative scenario where everybody will get SIRS and then resale prices start to skyrocket. Then that kills affordability. So we want things to be affordable, we want things to be more long-term stable, and we will allow some price downtrend even with the extension of leases, because the physical property itself will deteriorate over time. No matter how good your maintenance is, the rust is happening. So there will still be a bit of a value drop, but it will cushion, because by the time you hit the correct age timeline, you will be renewed or you will be rebuilt.
Let me just see because we can only take the final round of questions. How many are there? There's one there. That's it, right? Okay, excellent. Oh, right on top. Okay, so last two questions.
Hi, gentlemen. Thank you very much for providing a very enlightening presentation. There's some very, very good ideas here. My name is Jonathan, and I'd like to ask you to unpack a little bit more about about your proposals to combat the issue of declining property values, where you're saying you would want to automatically top up, leases of flats are beyond 50 years of age. Now, would that mean that seniors, especially the ones which are asset rich and cash poor, will be therefore able to utilize, unlock more of their lease, will be able to sell back more of their lease to the government? Is that the intended outcome? Because we face a crisis where there are a lot of people that just don't have enough savings to see through their entire retirement. And if that's going to be the case, how much would that cost? Because that would be generated from somewhere, and where do you think this money will come from? I think that's something that weighs heavily on all our minds. Thank you.
Okay. Final question, right? Back.
Good afternoon, everybody, and honorable speakers. Few questions. Number one, just like to hear from you the forecast for this project or the Smart Singapore, the population as it is, we have 5.8 million now. So maybe in 30 years or 50 years time, what would you guys foresee the population should be for this? Number two is like a rising sea level, as what our Prime Minister has spoken about earlier on. And lastly, about our CPF. Reason is most of us finance our houses, including especially HDB with the CPF. As it is now, it's 2.6%. So if this new scheme comes forward, I foresee that the increase in value shouldn't be too much, right? So how can we overcome? Would that be a negative value in the flats to offset from the retirement sum from our CPF over there? All right, thank you.
Thank you. Where's the final question? Right at the back. Okay.
Hello, thank you. I'm Sing Zhou. My question is on policy trade-offs. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate more on what are the trade-offs that are involved other than the obvious fiscal expenditure that's required. And if there are no obvious trade-offs at the moment, then what might you think are the highest risk factors for that ruins the success of these policy recommendations? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for all these questions.
I think for issues like the rising sea level, this has not been the issue of climate change and rising sea level has not been incorporated into this study. So that's a separate issue. I believe the Prime Minister has talked about a figure of $100 billion over 100 years, right? And he's talking about, mitigating sea level change by building dikes, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that is separate from this. So I'd just like to clarify that. And sorry, I didn't get your question. You say that, are you worried about a rise in CPF rates to finance this project? Was that your? Okay, so in that, I don't think there should be negative returns for your retirement, because if anything, the value of flats either going to be the same or it's going to be higher, right? So if they preserve your capital gains, essentially Singapore has had tremendous capital gains accruing to every single HDB owner in their flat, right? And this has been the way of sharing the prosperity of the economic miracle that has been in Singapore. And this prosperity through capital gains has accrued to almost every level of society, and in fact forms the bulk of the increase in wealth at the bottom 50% of a society. So it is a very key mechanism of sharing prosperity, increasing these capital gains, right? So here what we're doing is we're preserving these capital gains, or in fact extending them by bringing something closer to a freehold value that has a rebuilding value, a free rebuilding value embedded in it. Okay, so you're preserving the value of this real estate for existing citizens, while making the fact that you own land, because you own the land as government, you can provide new cheap housing available to your new citizens who want to get into housing, because you already own the land. No other country already owns the land. So they cannot make public housing available at the cost that we can, because we need only charge construction cost, right? So we are in this, like I said, the hard lifting has already been done by the Land Reform and Land Acquisition Act many years ago. So we need to capitalize on this asset as policymakers to deliver both affordable housing for the young and preserve the prosperity that the people who already have flats that have accrued to them, because this is their right as Singaporeans. That's the way to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, on the question of maximum population, I think first of all, I think the 10 million is crazy. Because I think the fourth industrial revolution actually implies we will need actually less people. So the question is going to be, there may be in the interim a necessity to increase the number of population, basically the workforce. But as it transitions into the AI economy, then I think they will just be sent home.
Okay, can I say this? About the issue of terminal population, it's a very important one. And it's been raised again because our Prime Minister no less has hinted at a 10 million terminal population. Now, when we had the white paper quite a few years ago, we hinted at a population, not a terminal population, but a population in 2030 of 6.9 million, am I correct? And there was tremendous resistance to that figure, sufficient political resistance such that the Prime Minister in his closing remarks on this in Parliament said, it should be our aim to keep the terminal population, that means to say in year X, 2050, 2060 and beyond, well below 6.9 million. I'm quoting him and his words, right? If I, as an economist, do the numbers, I find that it is very feasible. First of all, it's very difficult to maintain a decent rate of growth without population at least growing to 6 to 6.5 million. Okay, but if we maintain a disciplined rate of immigration, if we follow the immigration policies, let's say, of a country like West Germany, right, which has a very high productivity, which is an extremely competitive country, the immigration rates are pretty controlled, except for this Syrian thing, pretty controlled. We can, if we take a labor force growth rate of less than 1%, end up with a terminal population less than 6.9, around 6.5 million, and we can have pretty high productivity growth. And Keng Soon has made the point that with AI, etc., and with the configuration into smart cities, we can have high quality growth because we can have productivity growth, growth driven by productivity growth and not labor force growth. Total growth is simply the sum of labor force growth plus productivity growth. So the more productivity growth you have, the less labor force growth you need. To achieve a population of 6.9, which I think is 6.5, which I think is the maximum tolerable population for Singapore, my humble opinion, you do need that high productivity growth implied in our smart cities, right? And you do need immigration discipline not to repeat the mistakes that we did in the last, in 1990s and 2000s, letting in 1.2 million unskilled and semi-skilled workers that set the stage for population. And if we continue that track, population will be 10 million and more. So we have a choice. We can choose to have a more disciplined immigration, a more high productivity, high quality growth, and be like a country like Germany, be like Switzerland, high quality, high value added country. Or we can be like Dubai, right? You just let in as many people as possible and you maximize growth with all its attendant social difficulties. Imagine managing a population of 10 million people in Singapore. To me, I think that would be disastrous.
Okay, so we've run out of time. I'd just like to thank all the speakers and all of you for attending and the speakers for their presentation. You can get the full paper where a lot of the details which to the questions you may have may be addressed in that full paper or even in the executive summary at the FOSG website, which you see above. Thank you very much. I would now like to invite the press to stay back for just a brief session, just for points of any clarification. The rest of you, thank you so much. Good evening.